The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, where I, your host, Tylor, try to describe how much I love these books, despite the fact that we're not quite to the books that I love. And Greg, my co-host, shows up and tells me that the books we're reading are actually pretty good, or at least that's usually what he says. Greg, is that the message this week, or is it still dragging like it had been a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, I think we're in a steady pattern this week. I wouldn't say it declined demonstrably, and I'm sure you're excited that we're getting back to some Perrin content. Hey, this seems silly, but this moment we're recording in, there's this lull in culture, right? It's related to the strikes. There's like no good TV. There are just a weird little kind of month and a half where there are no good movies. So, hey, it's good to have the books and something to kind of fill our time. Now, I know you are enjoying the television show, so probably can't agree that there's not a lot of good TV right now. But how's that going? Spoiler free.
Spoiler free, it's going really great, although mostly spoiler free. This week and next, we are actually going to be reading two scenes that in the show were combined and brought in a book early. So TV show viewers, you will see a few parallels coming in the next couple of weeks, particularly from episode 5 of the television show, which I guess was probably about a month ago if you're listening as we're releasing them. So almost kismet. We take those here. I don't have anything else really to add other than I thought these were 3 pretty good chapters, mostly because they were in my favorite character's head. Any last thoughts before we get into what I think we were saying right before we started to air was like some fun chapters, but I don't know that I have the most to say about any of them. Is that your impression as well?
Yeah, I think that's true. Our old cliche of when we're plot heavy, there's not as much to talk about, and I think we've got a lot of plot across these 3. That doesn't mean I didn't like them. It just means a little bit more action. So yeah, let's roll, Boo Boo. Let's do this.
I don't know how I feel about Boo Boo, mostly because that's what I call my dog.
Catchphrases. Let's roll, Boo Boo. Sounds great. Listeners, write in and see
every
and
episode. That is what we're going to say now. That's how this works. Chapter 33, Within the Weave. Perrin is riding down the road and notes an ancient cobblestone. They are on the Lugard Road near Murandy, although technically they are still in Altara. He sees that there is a dog's print imprinted into the stone, and he smells sulfur, but doesn't bring it up any further. They're pushing hard, but Perrin doesn't want to sleep deeply, despite the fact that he's extremely tired, and he recalls a couple of bad dreams he's had, including one that featured Egwene, that is a callback to a previous chapter when Egwene was dreaming. They pass through a number of villages on their travels. We learn that Perrin is keeping the wolves out of his head, and all of the village they pass through seem to have some sort of oddity. He notes an entire village that was burned when all of the houses fell apart outward rather than inward. He notes that they found a village that was saved by a spring being discovered, and then another one where a well went dry, or every well went dry, another one where every argument flared up all at once, and then another where all of the crops died, but a bag full of gold was found from Manetheren, and it saved the village. Perrin is kind of concerned about this and starts asking how the Perrin could do such evil. And Moiraine's response is to basically say that the pattern weaves both good and evil, and it doesn't really play favorites. The Dark One and the Creator are the ones who are really aligned with one side or the other. They then entered the town of Remin, which Lan says has had an eventful day or two. Loyal seems very pleased when all the people in the town recognize him as an Ogier rather than being afraid. And as they get into town, they note there is a tall man in a cage, and boys are throwing rocks at him, and Perrin thinks he looks familiar. Once they get into the innkeeper greets them warmly, and then starts asking Moiraine after what's happened. And then, Moiraine starts asking him after what's been going on in the town. He says that there are hunters for the Horn who have been battling Aiel, and then that causes Perrin to immediately realize why he recognizes the man in the cage. It's because he looks like Rand. He is in Aiel. He then remembers Min's vision that he was going to meet an Aiel in the cage, and it would be very important. And then he meets Lord Orban, the individual who claims that he and 11 others battled 20 Aiel and only lost 6 and killed most of them and captured 1. At this point, Lan starts to kind of question him about it and makes it clear that he doubts every one of this individual's claims. And then Perrin notices that there is a woman who is staring at him, not at Moiraine, not at the Ogier, but him. And he finds that odd as he leaves the common room. This was a chapter that I think kind of captured a lot of fun little scenes effectively, but the sum of it almost feels like less than the sum of its parts, right? It's a glimpse into the travel chapter, which is why I don't have a ton to say about it. I'm curious if that was your impression as well, or if you were kind of grabbed by any of the little moments I feel like we get throughout it.
Yeah, I liked the moment at the end where Lord Orban claimed to be 6'4", 215 pounds. I really, sorry, we don't do politics on this show, but you know, if a politician who is clearly an overweight man claims to be 215 pounds, call bullpucky on it. Yeah, I think you largely captured this chapter's spirits. It feels like it was meant to get us into this village to have this, you know, what we're told is a portentous encounter and a kind of momentous moment in Perrin's story. If I were to take a lesson from the first half, it would be that I felt like it was an escalation of Rand's powers, right? These are essentially Taviran powers that were being walked through. But it seems to me like, whereas before it felt like being Taviran meant things bent a little in your direction. Now, to steal the word for it, it's like everything is warped around him. Again, we've talked before about I believe it's Newtonian gravity, but I'm not a physicist, where the heavier the object is, it kind of pulls everything down. So I always had it explained as a taut cloth, and then a very, very dense, heavy ball bearing would make a little funnel there. And it feels like Rand's funnel is kind of sucking more and warping more into his wake. And you know, that also feels right because it's his literal wake. Well, I guess you can't say literal, but you know, the wake of a ship is the kind of eddies and the currents that fall behind it. And this is Rand's wake, right? He's passing through, and we get these little eddies and these little dramas that are just churning in response to him having been present. So that is very compelling and interesting, but I don't know what to say other than like, hey, I think he might be the Dragon Reborn.
Yeah, and I think that's the big thing about the early section of this chapter is it's kind of fun little vignettes that make you think like, what are all of the things that we're not hearing about? And that's a fun little game to play. But once you're done playing that game, I think what you're left with is like, yeah, Rand is warping the pattern the way that we said he was going to 12 chapters ago. There's nothing really new here. The other thing that I enjoyed about this chapter is I found it to be a really good excuse to get my book out and open up to the very first page and figure out where are they at on the map that we have. And so kind of tracing, okay, they are getting closer to Lugard, but they're along the dotted line border, and they're near somewhere where there's a river. You can kind of identify almost exactly where they are and how they're going to take that river dead south to Ilion. And I just found that to be kind of the most intriguing part of this. You've mentioned before, I think we are both people who love a good map in a book, and this felt like a go open up your map kind of moment moment at the beginning of the chapter. So that was the other little bit of fun I had with it. Did you also experience that, or are you now looking at your map for the first time and thinking, oh man, that's a smart idea, Tylor? You have to compliment me if that's what's happening.
First of all, I would never say that. How dare you? Second of all, I actually did open up my map at while reading, and what stuck out to me is nothing that we get the names of 3 or 4 villages. So I was kind of looking for those.
Yeah.
We do get the name of the river, so I was able to place us along that river, the Menetherinel.
I think
like
in
an
Menethrin
extension.
Drell, I think. Yeah, but yeah.
Drell. And so I was able to kind of place us there, but kind of it caused this moment when I was reading yesterday morning where I was like, it's striking that we've been using the same map the whole time. And
Yeah.
I don't know the publication history, so I don't know if the map was there in the first edition, first book, or if it was added later and adjusted. But I will say, oftentimes in a fantasy series like this, we would get a second map or a different insert. I'm thinking of the Game of Thrones opening credits where they change what cities and sections they focus on in a given season. Actually, they changed like episode to episode depending on what plot lines were getting picked up on. And so I kind of had a moment yesterday morning where I was sitting there being like, oh, I'd kind of like a little zoom in. But then I'm like, well, it's actually impressive that all the most important things were laid out from the beginning of my read through this book. It was at the first page of my first book. So there's it kind of works both ways, but it was interesting to think like, we're not getting a lot of change to this map.
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, the map is exactly the same in the first edition as it was in the final book. So actually a lot of readers who were kind of doing the book as we went, almost since that map never changed, took it as like cities on the map bingo, where it was like, which one is going to be the last one to show up? Because Robert Jordan couldn't possibly have put 17 cities on the map and then only taken us to 16. I forget if that happened or not, actually, and won't tell you even if I did remember. But that, I think you're right. There's something about the fact that that map never changes that it almost like you're saying, it's almost disappointing you're not getting to see exactly where they are at any given time. But I almost like that feeling of like, okay, can I triangulate where they are? It feels more like reading an old map, and I think that kind of works for me. Once we kind of come out of that, like here are 18 villages and the random things happening in them, we get kind of an interesting Perrin Moiraine conversation where he asks her, he seems almost worried, like, how is Rand doing so much evil in his wake? And Moiraine gives this really interesting, almost like philosophical answer about what is right and what is wrong and what the weave wants or does. That felt very like Ishmael in the old school, like not Dickens, Moby Dick, the one that you like. It seemed like something you'd want to talk about. Say things about it.
I'm sitting here quietly so that you can play literature scholar. So, yes, I had this. I actually, this may be a first, or it's at least a very rare occurrence. I dog-eared that page because I'm like, I feel like if there's anything here to talk about, we should talk about it. So we don't read actual text enough. That's me criticizing both of us.
Me.
So I will say here's this great line from Moiraine. So Moiraine was silent for a time, warming her hands. Finally, she spoke while staring into the flames. The creator is good, Perrin. The father of lies is evil. The pattern of age, the age lace itself, is neither. The pattern is what is. The wheel of time weaves all lives into the pattern, all actions. A pattern that is all one color is no pattern. For the pattern of an age, good and ill are the warp and the woof. And I'm not an expert on warp and woof, but as I understand them, those are the kind of ebb and flow, right?
Every time you say woof, I am going to laugh. I know that's probably the accurate term, but it's just funny to me every single time. That was actually my only star in this section. You said it was very important and we should talk about it. I just wanted to talk about how silly warp and woof sounded. But I do think there's something really this is one of those moments in this book that I have a really hard time with, because it is simultaneously interesting to think about and also bears absolutely no impact on the actual story that we care about, right? Like, to some degree, understanding the cosmology of the wheel is irrelevant because it doesn't matter if it's foredestined or being woven as we go. We just care what the characters do. And so that's kind of where I get stuck in discussions like this. Is I think it's interesting. I think it's great world building. I'm glad the characters are thinking about it, but I, as a reader, don't get too much out of sections like this.
Dear listeners, we finally found Tylor's equivalent to Greg reading about dreams. Tylor's is cosmology. He can't find the meaning there. Wow. All right, mark it down. Episode 375. We finally, I don't know. That's just what it feels like.
We are actually closing in on 100 relatively quickly.
Oh, all right. All right. Just feels like 375. Yeah, I think I did find this probably then more compelling. What stuck out is the age lace is new to this book, right? We kind of got that level up at the beginning of this, that the wheel is weaving a pattern, but then across all of correct me if I'm wrong, the age lace is across all the different times we've spun around the wheel, but also all the different layers, right? That was part of how they talked about the parallel dimensions.
I think that is
right?
I think that is accurate of the way that that idea was introduced to us. And more as the series goes on, I think the age lace will just be used as a phrase for any weaving of either lives or worlds. So I don't want to kind of be implying that that phrase only applies to like multi-world weaves, the way we were talking about at the beginning of the book. But you are remembering, right? That's the way it was kind of initially phrased.
And so it felt like, well, now that it's been introduced once, all the characters are going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And then the next piece of that, and it's not the first reference to the creator and the Lord of Lies.
Yeah, she
Prince
says Father
Lies.
of Lies, but I think that's
Father
just another
Lies.
term for the Dark One.
And that felt very Christian to me, right?
Yeah.
I believe that's a name for Satan. So, as we are tracing these different influences, it doesn't often feel overtly Christian, certainly not as much as something like C.S. Lewis, obviously, or something like that. But there is here, a way in which that felt like it followed those traditions. The last thing I'll say is, so I was raised in a Protestant Christian household, and I went through confirmation. And I always remember our first confirmation class, which is where you decide you're going to become a member of the church, and you go through classes to learn. The priest ended, like 2 minutes before the end of the session with like, okay, and so that's like the schedule. Any questions? And a girl in my confirmation class, I actually think it might have been my cousin, but I won't pin this to her, raised her hand and was like, yes. So if God is good, why is there evil in this world? And the priest like paused for a minute and was like, oh, like, well, I kind of just meant like, did you guys get enough snacks, or do you understand we're meeting every other Tuesday? But okay, let's tackle this, and gave like a 3-minute like exegesis on like why there could be evil in a world created by a benevolent God. And I mean, and again, I'm not pinning that on my cousin necessarily, but I respect the hell out of the move.
Yeah.
Like it was maybe not the right time, but it was like, if we're gonna do this, let's do this. Let's ask the hard questions. So this felt to me a little bit like Perrin making that move. And I actually kind of like Moiraine's answer in the cosmology of this universe. But, I think the idea that there's no pattern with only light is a simple kind of encapsulation of what, as I understand, we don't have our theologian friend on, but as I understand the way a lot of Christianity and other religions would answer that question is essentially that there has to be darkness to prove the light, or to let us have the chance to act in the light, we need darkness. And so and all that, if you just took a little nap on my like Greg's random backstory corner, it just means, hey, Perrin is a 18-year-old asking 18-year-old questions as well. So it works on that kind of basic level of, I enjoy teaching college freshmen because they are trying to figure out the world, and they ask questions that seem silly but are really profound and really important to them. And I thought this represented that well.
Well, and I think that this is something that we see in this chapter, and also I think the next one is Perrin seems much more open to just like having an honest conversation with Moiraine than Rand or Matt seemed to when they were traveling with her. And so this feels like a very different dynamic, and it feels like a more mature dynamic to me, right? Just being willing to ask for help when you need it is not a thing most 18-year-olds are capable of. And so I feel like
See also our teaching, but go on.
yeah. This is why I love Perrin, though, right? He's the character who just wants to have a conversation. And sometimes isn't that better than spending 45 minutes planning the lie you're going to tell every D&D player ever? I'm talking to you. We can move a little bit forward in the chapter, I think. The next kind of big moment that I had was I thought that all of the introduction of the 8 interesting things in this town was kind of fun. And, there was, a lot of kind of dynamic stuff going on. But to me, the most exciting part of it all was for some reason seeing Lan's reaction to it. He seemed like almost salty about what was going on. And like he immediately picked up on the fact that Orban is just a blowhard. And there was a lot of kind of like fun little subtle Lan moments in this chapter that I thought worked really well, and that continued into the next chapter as well. Did you also single out the random character who didn't have many lines, or was that just me?
I definitely thought about him a lot next chapter, but I think you're right to say it's the same mood. And attempting a movie reference for a movie I haven't actually seen, I think it's Danny Glover in Lethal Weapon, right? Like, I'm too old for this expletive. It's the kind of like, I think when you are the level Lan is, like a guy like Orban is going to rub you especially the wrong way. But it's just like, he's seen it all and he's tired of it all. And his concerns are, how much gold is this going to cost me? How little sleep am I going to get? And I guess I'm stealing a little from next chapter. For whatever reason, when I read him being so annoyed, I was like, is this is still the guy who's like in love with Nynaeve? Like it, and I don't mean that as a criticism. It's just like, I think, we're now a year-ish since he was like in love and sneaking quiet moments with her. And now it's like, oh, he's been on the road a long time, and I think it's getting to him.
No, and I think that's a really good read. And if we're thinking about Lan as kind of being worn down by all of this like constant pressure and having to, kind of be constantly the one searching and looking, and he's out ahead every day. I think he's just putting in more work than everyone else in the group. And then that to me is kind of contrasted by Perrin, who in this chapter almost seems relaxed is the word I want to use, right? Like a bunch of crazy things are happening around him, and he just seems like very like calm amidst all of it. And it seems like the only thing that breaks that calm is at the very end of the chapter when he identifies a woman who is looking at him. And I think there are two things here, right? One is we're obviously introducing a new character, this woman, but then two, I think there's something really kind of intriguing about how Perrin's mind works, that he isn't fazed at all by a lot of chaos around him, but as soon as even not chaotic things focus on him, that's what kind of throws him off his game.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing, but it feels to me like a person who is used to being the side character. And in this particular moment, he's becoming the main character, and in this thread of the plot or whatever. And, that obviously is informed by the fact that we are reading a book. But it does feel like there are, like, I know people who act that way. I have friends who are like, yeah, I'm the side character. I don't lead the charge. I just follow along. And in this moment, it's like, wait, why would somebody be interested in me? Because I'm not that interesting. And I think Moiraine gives us some reasons to consider next chapter as well. That might be at play. And it again, I think we've used this analogy before, but this felt like your D&D party entering a tavern, and you're just kind of taking stock of who's there. And I was thinking like, well, yeah, I would go ask my question of the innkeeper, because he seems to really flow with information. He,
I believe he.
I forget. I believe he. I would definitely not go engage these people over at the hunters because I have secrets I want to hide from them, and they just seem awful. And then the woman is the little mystery that the DM's like, no, this is the actual plot you need to care about, and please pay attention to her, and we will develop this in next week's session.
Don't act like you would talk to someone in Greg. The entire party would sit silently for 5 minutes while I decided what plot we would do next. I don't have anything.
Well,
else to say
I
about
need to
this
tip.
chapter.
I need to tip the listeners into our D&D world, which is we had a great D&D session on Saturday where Tylor had prepared a great, I assume, combat where we would fight these knights on giant birds, and they looked awesome. And he had miniatures ready to go. He was all ready to go. And some random member of our party, I don't even remember which, was like, let me try to like negotiate with them, and then rolled really well, and we negotiated our way out of the our combat, and that was the end of it. And like Tylor was instantly disappointed. I'm gonna admit I was disappointed. I'm like, I just wanted to fight. That's why we play this game. Why are we trying to avoid this? And it was a very funny moment. So to laugh about the plots not taken, that immediately comes to mind. Okay. You don't want to do the fun thing. All right. More walking through the desert it is. Let's do this.
And at least the one thing Robert Jordan gives us is that these are characters who immediately ignore all of the fun plot hooks in the inn. And then we get chapter 34, where Perrin goes to all of the fun plot hooks outside of the inn. So in chapter 34, A Different Dance, Perrin is thinking about the woman who is staring at him while the innkeeper is kind of droning on about the news of the day until Moiraine questions him when he talks about a dragon in Galen. He clarifies that he was not talking about a false dragon, but rather someone who was proclaiming the dragon, who Lan and Perrin immediately recognize must be Mazima, one of the Shinarans who is left behind at the beginning of the book. Once Moiraine realizes this, she immediately is upset at Mazima, slams her door, and then the innkeeper takes them throughout the rest of the inn. They have an ogier bed, with which Loyal is extremely happy about, and then Perrin literally sits quietly in his room and thinks about his problems for a while. Eventually, Perrin goes and talks to Loyal for a little bit more before he then decides to get out, thinking about Min's viewing and the fact that he has seen an Aiel in a cage. Perrin he stops and thinks about regretting not stopping the boys throwing rocks, and then he goes into Moiraine's room. She is in her robe. I wrote scandal in all uppercase letters because that's how he seems to approach this. And then he asks whether it was Rand who caused all of the chaos in this town. Moiraine says she hopes to find out when Lan returns, and then also says that she has a choice to make about whether they are going to go overland to Tyr and try to continue catching up with Rand, or whether they are going to take the river and take the boats, which will take a longer distance, but will get them faster. Eventually, Perrin asks Moiraine about whether or not she can sense dark friends because he thinks he might have identified one. And this is when Moiraine, as you alluded to, says, no, I don't think that woman is a dark friend. I think she just thinks you're attractive. And then Perrin leaves, noting that he didn't ask Moiraine anything about the Aiel in the cage. Perrin then leaves the inn, hearing Orban telling his story yet again, even more exaggerated this time, and then he approaches the cage. He sees no one around, but feels like he's being watched, and then after judging that the cage is really low quality, he lowers the cage, opens it, and lets the Aiel out. He introduces himself as Gaul of the Shardad Aiel, and he is a stone dog. He calls Perrin a wetlander, saying that he is from a place that has rivers and more water than he has ever seen before. And when he's asked why he is west of the mountains, he says that he is searching for he who comes with the dawn. Perrin assumes that this must be Rand and tells him that he should be looking in Tyr. At this point, the Aiel Gaul begins to get ready to leave when a large number of white cloaks show up. Gull, who doesn't have a weapon, kills 7 or 8 of them, and Perrin takes care of the other couple. And there are now a bunch of dead Aiel. Gull said, or sorry, not a bunch of dead Aiel, a bunch of dead White Cloaks. Gull says that this is the second time he's had to kill a bunch of Wetlanders, and notes that there weren't 20 of his people fighting Orban. There were actually just 2. And then he leaves, and Perrin turns around and sees the woman who was staring at him before. She runs away. He then sees Lan, and Lan is like, "Oh, everyone's dead. We need to leave now." So, action heavy sequence, which was just adapted on a television show, but nothing else here other than maybe an intriguing conversation with Moiraine. Is this the slowest of the 3 chapters or the fastest of the 3 chapters? Because I think I'm torn between those 2 answers.
It felt long when I read it, but again, listeners should always remember that I am probably also reading, and then suddenly a toddler comes and screams at me because a stuffed animal has a dot of mud on it or something, and so I get confused and scared and then just retreat into my book again. But what was funny to me, what stood out the most, is I immediately was like, "Oh, we saw this on the show," and then I paused and thought, like, "Oh no, wait, that's entirely different." So there's a scene, small, minor. So there's a scene in the first season of the television show where 2 characters cut down an Aiel who has been killed and bury him. And it was one of my favorite scenes in the first season. And so I was like, "Oh, it's that scene. We got there." And then I was like, "Oh, wait, that's entirely different people in an entirely different place." So while they may have been reminiscent, it was not at all the same moment. So, I mean, where did I really go with this? I was like, got it. The Aiel still are looking for Rand, and it just seemed like a fresh reminder. Like Game of Thrones would mention the White Walkers at the wall every once in a while. It's like, don't forget this plot's coming. Like we have this other set of issues that need to be dealt with. I still think that feels like a book 4 or book 5 thing, not a like by the end of this book the Aiel will come. But I think something that I'm struggling with, and I don't think this is a bad struggle, but something I'm struggling with, is I have to remember part of what we're seeing here are all the biases based on the fact that the Aiel were the enemies in the last war, the war that Rand's father fought, and that led to him finding Rand. Yes. And so to think about how the Aiel, every time they appear, feel like allies, right? If they're looking for Rand, they feel like, "Yep, they're on our side. Don't worry about it." And yet, they were what we see here is a bias against them, right? These people can get rounds of drinks bought for them by saying they killed more and more of them and putting this one in a cage to torture. So I think I have trouble tracking how these pieces are all going to interact. But there's no way I didn't feel like a righteous hell yeah, buddy, when Perrin cut him down and said, like, "I just don't like people in cages." That felt to me. I'm my movie watching project for the fall is I'm trying to see all the Harrison Ford movies I've never seen, and that felt like a Harrison Ford line to me, right? Like a little lopsided grin of like, "I just don't like people in cages." Not as old and grizzled as that because Matt's young, or sorry,
that was
Perrin's young,
solid work on that accent. I just need to say. I think the interesting thing that stood out for me in this chapter, because I think you're right, this sort of like reintroduction to the Aiel for the 3rd or 4th time is it's such an interesting kind of cultural point, right? We see how the town is reacting and how Orban is reacting, and then just by how Lan it responds to Orban, we knew something was up with how many Aiel he was claiming before we even got the numbers. And if we're kind of learning, as you're saying, all of these like almost seemingly contradictory, how do they piece together kind of pieces of information? There was something that really weirded me out in this chapter that I'm still trying to piece together. And maybe you can help me with this. What is up with Moiraine in this chapter? She doesn't notice that Mazima is the one that they are talking about, despite the fact that Perrin and Lan get it. And I can just see Moiraine doing the like Michael from The Good Place. Like, Oh my God, Perrin got it. This is a real low point, guys. And then just a little bit later on, when Perrin goes to ask her questions about what's going on with the pattern, she immediately responds, not just by answering his question, but volunteering unasked information about where they're going next. And those just feel like very unMoraine things, to miss obvious clues and then give up information with no prompting. And so I'm really kind of curious if you have a read with what's going on with Moiraine in this chapter, because I think the Aiel mystery is one that, as you say, is kind of like a wait a book or two kind of mystery. But this feels like a character who we've been with for most of their adventures this book. So maybe I'm missing what's causing her to be so off at this point.
I mean, I definitely read it as she is working on the next problem, right? I mean, and we see Lan doing this, right? Lan
Yeah.
is so busy worried about where they're going next and how they're doing this. I think um I think Moraine is unsettled by how quickly Rand is moving and the
Yeah.
actions he's taken, right? The fact that he broke away, it's not that I think she ever thought she controlled him, but she thought she was alongside him.
Yeah.
And from the moment he broke away, it's like she's playing catch up. And so I think, especially where she's like, "Oh, dude, you're just a cutie. Like, don't worry
Yeah.
about it. The girl's looking at you because she's attracted to you. Move along." And it just felt like she's so busy with like the next three levels of problems that she can't be concerned with the day-to-day problems here. And the weirdness of like I even she's kind of undressed as he walks
Yeah.
in and then he's blushing and all that. I was like, there was something kind of old Hollywood about that. Like
Yeah.
we don't have nudity, but like we'll show a bare shoulder. I've also been watching movies from like the 30s lately, and it's like here's a beautiful lady behind a dressing screen, and like
Yeah.
there's her shoulder, like ooh, and it
Ooh.
felt like one of those types of moments where you're like, implying a lot, but
Yeah.
so I took Moraine as being there. She's working on which
Okay.
I mean, she says which way are we gonna go to chase Rand? Do we take the easy path or the
Mhm.
faster path? Um, I think that's worry about him being in
Tear.
tier. Long I She doesn't want him to be in tier a long time before she gets there.
Yeah.
The longer he's in tier without her there, the more danger they're all in. So
Yeah.
I think that's where her mind is.
And as she's discussing the kind of fear that Rand gets ahead of her, she actually drops what feels like kind of a juicy clue. She doesn't say, I don't know how Rand could be staying ahead of us. Instead, she says, it almost feels like Rand has discovered traveling, but if he had, he'd already be in tier. And that kind of, I feel like, is a moment where Moraine is accidentally letting slip. She knows of the existence of something called traveling. And as a reader, I'm like, what is that? Why aren't we in her head? Please tell me. So that was another moment that got me kind of a little bit psyched amid what in general I think is a very internal chapter, right? We get a couple of scenes of Perrin sitting on beds alone. Moraine is clearly in her own head in this early section of the chapter. I think it's a very psychological section of the book in some way, which is why one of the moments that I really loved is when Perrin just like took a moment to feel bad about not stopping the kids from throwing rocks at the Aiel, because that just felt like a remarkably relatable moment from a high fantasy story to me being like, yeah, sometimes I wish I had yelled at kids too.
Yeah, that is very much the kind of regrets you have kind of after high school where you are like, yeah, like I don't know. I always remember one time that my friends were kind of bullying a kid on the playground, and it's like I think everybody turned out fine. My friends weren't particularly nasty. I think that guy has had a long and successful life, but you're like, why didn't I
Yeah.
intervene in that? Why did we like all just go along with making fun of this poor kid? And so it does feel natural and very human, and that works. Certainly. I agree.
I have nothing else to say about the not amazing badass parts of this chapter. So we should probably jump forward to Gaul and a fight scene that you should probably say you want to see on television. Greg is holding up his finger like he doesn't want to talk about the awesome fight scene. So
One
whatever.
thing I just want to mention from the early half of the book that I liked and felt really bad about is Loyal being excited about his bed. He's
Oh
like, look at
yeah.
my bed. It's tree singing. And he says he could do that pretty well. And I like this,
Yeah.
it's a little like the Ents who can, herd the forest, but the idea that you can essentially woodwork by singing it well and training the plants, like that's
Yeah.
great and that's awesome. Do I
100%.
think that's a major plot point? Not at all, but I found it very endearing. And when Perrin just doesn't care, I was like, oh buddy,
Yeah.
I care. Like, it is a nice bed. Good for you. It's thousands of years old. I'm excited for you.
I'm not allowed to
Um,
criticize anyone for interrupting me for more loyal facts. So that was a solid addition.
I mean, really the only thing I have down here is just like it was great. And,
Yeah.
Especially again, as I'm trying to track how the Aiel will interact with the politics we've seen, it's like they're natural allies. They hate the white cloaks. They seem on the right side, though I have a limited understanding of the fight before. But
Yeah.
Where my mind goes is it feels a little bit like this is the like they're the Native Americans, right? And so they lost the last war as the colonists took over the country and raised their cities,
Mhm.
but that doesn't mean they were wrong. And when people say they were barbaric, it's like, yeah, but what were you doing first, right? Like, I feel like that's a better understanding of them.
That is, I think, a very accurate depiction. If only the Native Americans had absolutely annihilated the settlers in the West, right? You've got to remember the Aiel didn't lose the Aiel War. The Aiel won the Aiel War and then walked away instead of conquering anything. But otherwise, I think that metaphor and how they're being perceived and how they're treated west of the wall, I think that's exactly right. But yeah, the Aiel are good enough warriors that they wrecked the rest of the world and then became the sort of like cultural and social pariahs in a way that I think you're describing.
Nice. And so then I loved I like killing white cloaks, right?
Yeah.
In real life or in the book. Always good to kill some dudes in white cloaks. Sorry, I don't know if our podcast can sponsor violence in that way. And so the action was awesome, and the way in which it's like the girl we find out this chapter the girl saw it all kind of
Yeah.
go down, the woman. So that was all intriguing to me.
Absolutely. I think the only other thing that really stood out to me is when Gaul introduces himself, we get like 3 or 4 what I feel like are kind of like dangling bits of lore, right? In the same way we've talked before about Star Wars has those moments where you're like, okay, what's that word they just used? And why are we never going to mention it again in 3 more movies? Things like he is a stone dog. I need to know what that means, right? Why is their chosen one called He Who Comes with the Dawn? And is Perrin right in assuming that He Who Comes with the Dawn is Rand? There's a bunch of like little details like that. I think at one point he refers to the Aiel Waste as the threefold land. And that's the kind of thing that immediately makes me go, now there's 3 pieces of information I don't know. So I'm just kind of curious if any of that little bit of like world building without exposition worked for you the same way that it did for me.
Absolutely. I was really intrigued by that. I don't know that I even questioned much that it is Rand. I was just like, it's Rand, because we know he's half Aiel and or all Aiel and so on. The one thing that I thought was really surprising in that bundle was that so many of their prophecies also involved Tyr.
Yeah.
That it would come specifically to that city for them as well. And so while again you could say, well, that means it's all coming to a head at the end of this book, I'm like, oh no, that just will affirm to them in this book that Rand is the one, and then they will seek him out. So Rand is feeling more and more like Blade is called a daywalker, right? Like somebody from one side who can associate with the other side, like that kind of figure. And while his origins were always a bit mysterious, I feel like this is, just a cool bit of mythology. I guess it's a little bit of Dune too, right? Like he's of one people, but accepted in the desert folk.
I think the Fremen
Better
are
prepare for
actually
that movie again. Sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think the Fremen are actually also a really good corollary for the Aiel, right? Like a
Yeah.
nomadic desert kind of warrior people who have this, connection to the land in spite of it being inhospitable. Yeah, really good comparison that you didn't actually make. We both get half credit on that one. Unless you have anything else, I have nothing else to say about this chapter, but we're not quite ready to get ready for the next chapter. We have a little ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast to talk about.
Yes. So an icon that we've actually seen before. We saw it last week, but decided not to include it. So the opening of chapter 35 in my mass market paperback, that's page 378, a kind of standard icon, a mix of black and white, something that looks like it could be the pattern on a dress my crazy kooky aunt would wear or something like that. And so we have what appears to be essentially ocean waves and a kind of repeated pattern that alternates between black and white. I would suggest to show like waves out across a distance, right?
Yeah.
And I am tipping my hand that I know this is a boat chapter, so it appeared last time on a boat chapter, so it feels very much like water. But in terms of icons we've looked at, I would note that it is entirely within its frame, which is kind of a rarity, that a lot spread out. And I would note that the frame itself has a heavy black frame on it, despite the central image being pretty, I think, exactly balanced between the two colors.
No, I think that's right. And I had the same thought about the frame kind of adding a little bit of darkness to it. And then I think to some degree, my big complaint about this image is it's too simple and too obvious, right? The entirety of the notes that I wrote down to prepare for our discussion of this was exclusively a How I Met Your Mother joke. I just wrote down boats, boats, boats. Like, that's all there is to say about this image. It's generic water, which gets us to a generic understanding of what it means. And that's what it is. Sometimes chapters are on boats, and when that happens, we use the boats, boats, boats symbol. That's all we've got here.
I am closing in, as I've been noting to readers since last summer when we first began book one. I'm reading the Jack Aubrey, Patrick O'Brien book series, which is 21 books. And you could sum up this entire series by just saying boats, boats, boats. So I'm there, and I'm here for it. As I flexed last time, I'm like, yes, talk to me about the top gallon. I know all about it. Not, and I mean, while there is a boat here, it isn't actually as nautical a chapter. It takes place on a boat, but it could be almost anywhere else.
So let's find out what happened on a boat, but could have happened anywhere else in chapter 35.
I'm on a boat.
The Falcon.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you only make your joke once and it somehow worked better than my let's lead into the I hate you. Chapter 35, The Falcon. Perrin rushes through the inn and he is hearing the same grossly exaggerated story again, although now he knows exactly how grossly exaggerated it is. Perrin almost stops to admire the bed and also the chair in Loyal's room. It's a little bit heartbreaking that he then needs to tell Loyal we are going to leave immediately, and gives him an oddly vague response when asked why. He simply says white cloaks. They make their way down through the back door. There's a spit dog, which is awesome. And then Perrin tries to convince the stable hands to stick to saddle their horses. They do not, but Lan gives them gold and they immediately do. And Loyal then expresses his excitement to be out on an adventure again and talks about how he needs to capture this feeling for his book. Lan then leads them to the pier. He finds them the next ship that is going to be leaving, and after a quick negotiation gets them all on board very quickly. The ship begins to push off, but the woman who was staring at Perrin earlier leaps on board and enters into her own negotiation to get passage, quote, as far as that one there, and points at Perrin. She then says she is assuming they are going to Ilion, and that she didn't tell the town what happened between Perrin and Gaul, and that all of the town assumes that Gaul did everything himself. She does note, however, that Orban is actually an excellent fighter, and she has seen him defeat 4 people at once. She says that she is a hunter for the horn, and that she originally was going to go looking with Orban in the Forest of Shadow, which is south of the two rivers. But then she says that she actually thinks the horn is going to be in Manetheren, and Perrin tries to kind of tempt her away from following him by suggesting that the horn actually is in Manetheren. She decides she is not going to follow that at all because, as she says, she thinks that she is going to find the horn by following the odd trail, and that is what Perrin and his friends represent. She then says that she calls herself Mandarb after being asked. Perrin laughs because, of course, that is Lan's horse's name. She then says she is named Zareen, and when Perrin says that that name fits her, she flinches and immediately gets mad, and then says she will call herself Fail, which means falcon, which immediately makes Perrin worry about the vision that Min had seen of a falcon and a hawk on his shoulders. So this is the shortest of our 3 chapters. I have the least to say about it, but maybe my favorite of the 3, just because I love new characters and especially ones with a little bit of mystery around them. And that, I think, is what we're getting here, a bunch of kind of odd non sequiturs about a character that we're meeting for the first time. What was your take on the Falcon and its titular character?
Yeah, I would say I don't have a lot to say as well, right? Fallout from the last chapter. You shouted out the kind of endearing moment when Loyal's like, okay, like
Yeah.
we'll just move on, and then tries to kind of rally and get excited about this new life. I don't know. It did, between that and the one before, I think it naturally makes me feel like Loyal's getting a little bit lost in this shuffle.
Mhm.
He also had to sit out the final battle of the last book, so I'm starting to have some slight questions about why he's here. But trust that there will be a reason eventually. And then, boy, it sounds like ratings are getting a little low. We've got some online message boards telling us we have too many male characters. Let's throw in a badass new woman hunter and let her bring a new dynamic, and we'll have her appear during May sweeps, but the new season will really be about her. It's kind of how this feels.
I think that basically sounds about right, right? Fail is showing up out of nowhere at a point where this book needs just a little bit of a pick me up. And the one thing that I think is really interesting to me is that by the time we get to this chapter, this is the 3rd time that we have Perrin describing what I'm just going to call her Fail looks like. Right? In the first of our 3 chapters, he describes her as kind of a mysterious woman. He describes her nose. He's trying to figure out whether he thinks that she is kind of like beautiful or whether her nose is a little too large. He's kind of observing her kind of neutrally. And then by the time we get to this chapter, Perrin, it almost seems like, is deciding, like, I'm not really worried about this girl. I kind of like the look of her. And he goes, I think the weird like transition that happens is he goes from not knowing whether her nose is too big to deciding that it's just right for her face. But that feels almost monumentous when you get almost the same description 3 times a row in 3 chapters. So I thought this was kind of an intriguing introduction, although, as you say, it's like, yeah, we need another character now. Let's just toss this one in there.
Definitely. So, podcast crossover moment. My movie podcast I'm on somewhat frequently is anticipating the Oscar movies, which, of course, this year involves Bradley Cooper donning a prosthetic nose to play Leonard Bernstein, which in no way resembles the real life Leonard Bernstein. And there's been charges of anti-Semitism, and then Leonard Bernstein's estate had to come out and defend the choice and say they're cool with it, even though it's not what he looked like. It's a really bizarre set of nose discourse. So on that podcast, we've been returning to the refrain from Ocean's 11, which is Linus, Matt Damon's character, saying the nose plays. And so as I read this chapter, I thought Perrin is having this debate, and then he's just like, the nose plays. It works. It's going on. So and all of what you just said is also me thinking about how I do think that it's naturally like this is the pairing off, right? And a lot of fantasy series get to this point where eventually you like all of our young attractive people need young attractive people to pair off with, and it's just like especially where this is faded from Min and sitting on your shoulder. The way, I mean, we're both married men. That's what we ask our wives to do, is sit on our shoulders. Like some weird chicken fight we do
That's
on the
what
weekend.
Saturdays are for, right?
Yeah. So it just feels like, okay, we've gotten the pairing off. So it felt like a meet cute, and we'll go through the stages of we hate each other, we love each other, let's fight to the end together. So I'm here for it. That's not at all dismissive, but it was just kind of like, yep, let's check the box. Here's the character that he's going to end up with.
Totally. And if we're kind of tracking characters who are kind of new to the story and where do they end up in our estimation, I feel like we get just enough detail about Orban that it makes sense to kind of check in on him, as it seems like we are now sailing far, far away from him, because Robert Jordan loves to conserve characters and he's probably going to come back at some point. I actually can't remember whether he can. I'm just assuming he does. But I think that with Orban, the interesting thing that happens in this chapter is the beginning of the chapter is we hear him telling the story of his battle with the Aiel, now knowing the actual details of the battle, and he comes off looking absolutely horrible, right? He just looks like a pompous buffoon who is playing up his injuries to get as much, attention as he can. And then the chapter ends with Fael being like, no, I've been traveling with that guy for a while. He's a drunk idiot, but even when he's drunk, he's one of the best fighters I've ever seen. And I think that's a kind of like interesting reappraisal of a character who it's very easy to write off as a doofus after 2 chapters of being in a room with him. And that's something I think Robert Jordan kind of surprised me with. I don't know if I remembered that. I think I had kind of remembered the dumb hunters from these scenes, but at least one of them has some skill.
Or so says the person who's just spent a bunch of time following him.
That's fine.
So, we have to trust that. I think you're telling me you can trust that. But yeah, I think he was going to fight in the Aiel War, but then his dad's doctor said he had bone spurs. So that's why he didn't have to fight in that. I'm going to continue that comparison, which will probably alienate somebody who listens to us, but just say, this is the figure I put in my head. It's like, yep, a blowhard who, is all talk of being a manly man, but then does no such courage or shows no such courage or skill. So you're right. So then the turn that, oh, he's actually not so bad is interesting. I was like, if Elsie came back, this guy's coming back, because we make sure we give 2 memorable shout outs to him, and it just kind of felt like, if he doesn't come back to Perrin, it seemed very easy that he will cross into somebody else's story in the back half of this book, because then it's easy to have him show up and be doing something idiotic in the woods and people cross through and are endangered by it. So certainly not hoping for his redemption, but actually intrigued to see him come back again at some point.
And as far as I think I'm concerned, and probably Robert Jordan is concerned, mission accomplished, right? If we can have 3 chapters where we get 1 new character in with the gang and get 2 new intriguing characters who are running off to do something else and will show up eventually later, that's great, right? That's building pieces that can then get worked into later in the story. And what I'm left with then is the end of this chapter is what I have noted as the name game, right? We start with Mandarb, which is laughed off because it's obviously a horse's name. And then we switch to Zareen, which we are told suits her, but when she is told it suits her, she gets mad about it. And then we end up at Fael, the name that was foretold. And when a character gives us 3 names in 3 paragraphs, I feel like there's something going on there with like who this character is and how they're portraying themselves. And so I'm curious what you thought of that kind of scene of a character we don't know very well choosing what to call themselves very deliberately.
Hidden past, right? Like I think that's the most obvious answer. It's like there's something going on here where the fluidity of identity means that there's something hidden there, or just that this person lacks definition. She seems a little sure of herself, so I think it's more about making sure nobody can trace where she's from or who she really is than it is anything else. But I mean, Zareen, as she says, is the name that is hers.
The
That's how
name
I
she was
interpreted
born
that,
with, I
right?
think she says. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, but that's an interesting figure as well, right? A great hunter who doesn't seem interested in making a name for themselves. I mean,
yeah.
she's more fluid than that. And you know, when you have a fluid character, it's hard to hammer them down because you can't hammer a liquid. Take it to the bank.
And if we're talking about hammering a liquid, choosing the blacksmith as the character to make that metaphor about just A+
Ayo.
work. I have nothing else to
Oh
say
man.
about these chapters. I
Yeah, we
think they
got to
were
close on
fun.
that.
They were breezy. They worked. We have 3 chapters coming next episode. So that is chapter 36, Daughter of the Night. Chapter 37, Fires in Cairhien. Yes, that's apparently how that city is pronounced now. And chapter 38, Maidens of the Spear. And I have been talking up for a little while when this book starts to get going kind of at a really quick pace as opposed to a slow one. And I think we will start to see that transition just a little bit more in these next few chapters. And we'll get to do that. I'm not even going to let you say anything else, Greg. We will do that next time through the Glass Columns.
Yay.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.